So site grading in Civil 3D, what's the challenge here? What are we after here? Why do we use Civil 3D or attempt to use it for site grading? We want to model things. We want to avoid drawing manual contours. Civil 3D is supposed to be a modeling tool. We don't want to draft manual contours. So I'm going to attempt to show you ways to avoid that manual drawing of contours. And we want to minimize point-by-point grading. So you take a fairly complex parking lot or any kind of site features, and there's a lot of geometry in there, and there's a lot of key points that spot elevations that you may end up labeling in the final plan. But for the most part, when we talk about a parking lot, for example, we have some general drainage patterns that we want to use to govern how we model that or how we grade that. So we're going to try to look more holistically at how we grade this and not do point-by-point grading. And of course, how do we combine simple tools to create these dynamic surface models? That's another challenge. The tools we're using, as I mentioned, are feature lines and grading tools and surfaces. And by themselves, they're fairly simple, but how you combine them is kind of the trick to it. So I'm going to attempt to show you some tips and tricks on that today. So we're going to spend most of our time in the software, as we always do, and we're going to start out with some pond grading. And I'm going to use this to kind of introduce some of the basics of site grading, and that's use of feature lines and grading tools. And we'll move on to the parking lot. That'll be the bulk of what we spend our time on. It definitely is the most complex part of this. And we're going to look at making a couple surfaces. One will be a drainage surface, one will be a curb surface. And I'll talk more about that in detail once we get there. Then we'll have some miscellaneous grading to tie into an existing building that's there, and then also between the pond and the parking lot and so forth. So that's what we're looking at. So let me jump into Civil 3D. And here's that site that we had in the PowerPoint. And what we're going to start out with first is this pond. So the magenta or the purple line at the bottom here is just a simple polyline. In fact, everything I have, including the yellow lines here, are just 2D polylines. So we've jumped past the 2D layout of our parking lot. We're looking at the grading of this. So this is just basic AutoCAD drafting to generate polylines like this. All the grade outlines are existing streets and driveways that we're tying into. So this is actually this building right here is actually CTC's new office, and this is kind of a mocked up new parking lot that we're supposed to get sometime in the future. So what I've removed is the existing parking lot we have here, and we're putting in a different smaller parking lot, in fact. So that's the example here that we have today. So starting down here to grade this pond. Ponds are probably one of the most ideally suited features to grade with feature lines and grading tools. And the way you want to start out is with at least a baseline. So I'm going to take this polyline, I'm going to turn it into a feature line. So I have create feature lines from objects. You have this with a lot of tools in Civil 3D. And I can pick this polyline, and then it prompts me to specify some settings for this feature line. One of the first things here is a site. Those of you who aren't familiar with sites, what sites are about is it's not something you see on the screen, but rather it's kind of a container that you see in tool space. So if we have feature lines in the same site, they interact with one another. Specifically, if two feature lines cross one another, they assume the same elevation at that point. In our site model here, we want that interaction sometimes, and other times we don't want that interaction. So I'm going to make a new site right away. I'm going to call it pond and curb. So we're going to be putting some of our curb grading in the same site. I'm going to make or give it a certain style. We'll give it a style of basic. And then I'm going to assign some elevations. You'll notice the layer options here. Those who are unfamiliar, there's object layer settings that will take the name of your site and place feature lines thrown in that site all on the same layer. This is pretty handy to be able to turn off sets of feature lines using layers very quickly. So we're going to assign elevations. We're also going to erase existing entities that will get rid of that polyline. We could certainly keep it intact, but I want to keep a single source of my site design. And weed points would be to remove points from the polyline. For example, there's a vertex here and a vertex there. I have no reason to remove any of those. As I have this feature drawn, this polyline drawing, I want each and every vertex that's in there. So there's no reason to weed points. I hit OK, and then I get the Assign Elevations dialog box. This is where I have options for how I assign elevations. What I'm going to do here, in fact, is to pull elevations from a surface, and that's going to be from my existing surface. So I'm going to hit OK, and right away that turns blue. That's the feature line style I assigned. Okay, so I have a feature line now here. This is basically a 3D polyline with a few extra options on it. One, it has curves. 3D polylines can't have that. But like 3D polylines, every vertex can have a separate elevation. Feature lines also have stationing associated with them, and then they can interact with one another as well as with grading objects. So in a Civil 3D world, feature lines replace 3D polylines. I can pick on a feature line and I get a whole set of tools in the contextual ribbon here. I'm going to point out a few of the key tools here. The first one being this one right here. This is Quick Elevation Edit. If you know one tool with feature lines, this should be it. Quick Elevation Edit. I click on that and I can hover over any of these vertices and it tells me the elevation it's at. So these are elevations that came from existing ground. So I'm going to continue to use this quick elevation over and over throughout the webinar. I can also hover between two vertices and I get an elongated triangle, and that allows me to specify a slope. So for example, I can pick here and set this elevation to 809. If I were to hover away from that and point away from it and then do a grade of 0, 809, 809. Okay, so this is point-by-point grading. So someone sent in, they said it's a little tough to see the blue feature line. Let's pick a different color. That should be a little brighter, a little easier to see. In fact, I'm also going to turn on my line weights. That should make things a little bit easier to see too. Another common tool with feature lines, I pick on it, I have Elevation Editor. I click on this, I get this table view of each and every vertex in my feature line. And as I pick on those, any number of these entities, any of these vertices, I get a triangle that shows up. Okay, so this is another handy way to be editing. To me, it's not so great for point-by-point editing. It's great for doing things like this. I pick in there and I do Control-All to select all of these. And then I set all of these to one elevation. In this case, I'm going to go to 797 for a starting point of the baseline in my pond. Okay, we'll continue on. We'll use other feature line tools. These really are the baselines, or the kind of the building blocks of site grading as feature lines. These will be used as break lines on a surface. They'll also be used to attach grading objects to. So we do have a pond grading webinar in the past that we did, so I'm not going to get into real detail, but simply throw a simple pond in here using these grading objects. So I launched the grading creation tools right up here. And before I do this, I'd realized I had a couple extraneous surfaces in here. These are ones we want to create as we go through this. Let me delete these here. So just down to that EG surface. Okay, first button on the left here, we have to define what's our site we're going to build this grading group in, and then also create a grading group right here. Good practice is to call these by the same name as the site. So call the grading group pond and curb. We're going to do automatic surface creation, and we're going to have it create a surface style or a surface for us. This tessellation spacing, this is about how much detail we get with the surface along our grading objects. I'll point that out in a little bit once we create a grading object. And let's create, let's call it pond and curb. It's remembering my previous name, that's fine. We'll call it pond and curb, hit OK, pond and curb for a surface, and hit OK, and OK once again. So this is just setup. The next button here is to specify my target surface. My target surface is my daylight surface. So it's not the surface I just created. That was my pond and curb surface. That's what will generate once I start making features here. So what a grading object is, it's to grade from a feature line, for example, at a given distance for a given slope, or it's to grade from a feature line at a given slope to it until it ties into a surface. We're going to use both of those right here. And what I have in here is I have some criteria set defined. If I click on this, I have two of them in here. The basic set is what comes with Civil 3D, and then I have one called sites. And in here I have some custom grading criteria defined. So I have one here for distance x to 1. And all this allows me to do is to specify a distance at a slope, a rise over run, and then we'll grade at that distance. So I set the grading type, I click create grading, and then I go and pick the feature line. It prompts me in the command line, so go ahead and watch in the command line there. Select the grading side, that'll be to the inside. I'm going to say yes for the entire length. And I'm going to go a distance of 10 feet. And I'm going to go a slope like that. Okay. So what a grading object is, if I pick on it right here, that's one grading object. If I take a look at this, an object viewer, it's a simple plane defined by a slope and a width. Okay, so very simple elements. We put these together to make all sorts of different features in our site. Okay, I can also pick on here and I can edit this grading, for example. I can edit this, instead of going 10 feet, I'll go 20 feet. And I'll go the same slope. And what it does pretty nicely, especially when you have a feature line that's at all the same elevation, is it just figures out that bottom for you, and it kind of trims and targets itself. So grading tools are great for this feature right here. So very basic pond we're making here. From here I'm going to grade up to the outside, and I'm going to tie into an existing grade, but only on the back side here. So I'm going to do a daylight, a 3:1. So this is going to be a 3:1 slope, and it's going to match into my existing grade. So everyone can see, we'll go ahead and turn on our existing grade so we can see those contours. Quite a few contours there. We will adjust that to a different contour interval. Enough contours there. Okay, so that's what we're matching into. There's a lot of relief on this site. Okay, so it's going to be a pretty steep parking lot. We're going to end up with some retaining walls and so forth. So I'm going to do a daylight 3:1. I'm going to pick this same feature line, and I'm going to pick to the outside. It says select grading side. I'll pick to the outside over here, and I'm going to say no for apply to entire length. And I'm going to grade just roughly on the back half of this, because in between the parking lot and the pond, we're going to do something else. And so I can specify a station range and grade roughly on the back half of this. And that didn't tie in. Let me check some of my grades here. Let's go look at that feature line. Elevation editor, let's take a look at that. We're way up at elevation of 7,000. That's not what we wanted. We wanted 797. So we couldn't tell any difference because all the contours were just the same there, but they were 7,000 feet up out of the page there. So let's try this grading again. Now it should be able to find the existing ground surface. And I did entire length. Let's redo that. I'm going to delete that grading. You notice I ran the delete grading command. I also ran the edit grading. You always want to edit things through that interface there instead of just picking on them and clicking the erase button or running the erase command. So grading side, we'll go to the outside. We'll say no for entire length. And now we got what we're after. Okay, so a lot of relief here. We're tying into a steep slope here, but we have to capture some of this water in this pond here. So just for simplicity, I'm going to turn this existing surface back off. But just so you know what was there, I wanted to turn it on for a few moments. Okay, let's move on to the parking lot here. Parking lot grading is best handled with a different approach to it. We're going to use feature lines and grading objects, but one of the things I want to mention here is how we're going to use two surfaces to do this. We're going to create one surface that represents the pavement of our parking lot, and we're going to create another one that represents the curb and some of the grading behind the curb. And if we step back a little bit and we think about how is a parking lot graded, what is a drainage pattern in a parking lot? It's often pretty simple. It's drainage to this or that catch basin, perhaps a ridge or a swale here and there. And the overall drainage patterns are fairly straightforward. They can get a little detailed around buildings and things like that, but for the most part, you're sheet draining this way or that way at a 1 or 2 or 3%, depends on the scenario. So what we're going to attempt to do is separate the drainage of a parking lot from the detailed horizontal design of it. So this will kind of become clear as we work through this. But what I'm going to start with is to define a very simple L-shaped surface that represents the overall drainage pattern of our parking lot. And this is going to be a surface that goes beyond the extents of our parking lot. So I'm going to start and I'm going to base it on the building up here. So I'm going to start by drawing a polyline from these two faces, okay? And extend these. I'm going to trim these right here. And then I will join these two polylines to make one polyline. Okay, so that's an existing building. So its elevations dictate what kind of, the elevations of our parking lot. So that's where we're going to start with. We're going to turn this into a feature line, and it's going to represent what that pavement grading should be as it extends up to the building, okay? So let's start by just making that a feature line. Create a feature line from objects. We'll put it in a different site now, okay? So what we're going to be making is a handful of feature lines that represent a drainage surface, but we don't want these feature lines to interact with these yellow lines that will be turned into curb feature lines. So I'm going to put it in a new site called drainage. Take a basic feature line style and we're going to assign elevations. And what we're going to do is we're going to set this to 810.5. So finished floor elevation is 811. We're going to go to 810.5. So why is that? Okay, this is at 810.5. If we think about the entrance, which is roughly right over here, what this surface is going to represent is the pavement grades. So the elevations out here of the pavement. If I were to take that, say we're grading 2% to the east, if I were to take that grade or that plane and extend it up to the building, I would want the start of that grade to be roughly a foot below, or excuse me, a half a foot below finished floor, because I have a curb drop. So there's concrete or a walkway up here, and I have a curb that steps down. So the surface down here at the bottom of the curb is 6 inches below finished floor elevation, but also some kind of flat grade away from the building so that water drains away. So we're going to start at 810.5, but we don't want that everywhere. In fact, over here, some of this is partial basement, so we're going to steepen this up a little bit. So let's pick on this and let's go and use our insert elevation point. So that what this does is gives us additional vertices in our feature line. And I'm going to leave that at 810.5. I'm also going to put one roughly down here and leave that at 810.5. So I have two extra elevation or grade breakpoints. That's where the entrance is, and from here I can adjust my grades accordingly. So I'm going to use my quick elevation edit now. I'm going to hold 810.5, but from there I'm going to grade up at a 2%. So that would put this up here at 811.53. And from this flat spot right here, I'm also going to grade down at a negative 2%. That will put that some considerably below finished floor. I'm also going to put another elevation point right here. And from this corner down here, I'm going to grade up at a 2%. And I'm going to bring it up even a little bit steeper over here. Like I said, this is basement on the partial basement on this side right here. So the grade at the face of the building on the outside is above finished floor. So that's why this is coming up to 813.75. So we'll adjust that accordingly. We're just trying to get a basic model put in place. Okay, another great feature line tool is the stepped offset command. We're going to take this feature line and we're going to do an offset to give us another L-shaped feature line, and that's going to be on the east side and the south side of the parking lot. And we're going to do a stepped offset so that we can have it offset at a 2% grade, a negative 2% grade. So stepped offset. Then I'm also going to run this through command. So T for through allows me to not have to type in a number with the regular offset command like we have with AutoCAD offset command. This one works the same way. You have through, and then instead of typing a number, I can just pick a point out here, and then it prompts me to specify elevation difference. I'm going to say G for grade and go at a negative 2%. Okay, so that gave me an offset feature line, and the elevations are at a negative 2%. Okay, so this whole feature line, both of these feature lines, and now these represent the first two baselines of my drainage surface. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect these with a couple other feature lines, and we're going to make one closed border. So I'm running another feature line command here, and I'm just drawing it manually. It works a lot like the polyline command, except it prompts you for elevation. So as I pick here, you see right after I pick it gives me an elevation, so I just accept that. Okay. And what I snap to, of course, it's reading those elevations. I've got that same 813.75 right there. So I'm going to pick this feature line, I'm going to run a join command. So all these commands up here, a lot of them are like regular polyline commands, except you only have about half as many, and these are specific to feature lines and other Civil 3D line types. So I'm going to run a join. I'm going to join all of these to give me one closed feature line. I'm now going to add this to a surface. So these are 3D lines, and we're going to use them as break lines in a surface. It's really nice. Right in your right-click menu, have a Add to Surface as break line. And we're going to put this in a new surface. It's not going to be the pond and curb one. It's going to be a different one called drainage. I'm going to hit OK. And I get the Add Break Lines dialog box. A lot of you have probably added break lines to a surface in Civil 3D before. I want to mention just one thing in here, which is the supplementing factors down here. So there's those weeding factors to pull vertices out. Here's supplementing factors. This is the opposite. So what does that mean? What does that do? If I set a supplementing factor of 25, when I add these as break lines, what is that 25? Let me change my surface style and that'll make sense. So here's my surface. You can see the gray triangles. Those represent my tin. And here's my feature line. Well, this break line has a vertex right here and a vertex right here. Okay, if I set supplementing factors to 25, it's going to force the tin to triangulate at least every 25 feet along this feature line. You want to do this when you have feature lines with long constant grades like this that are break lines in your surface. It'll allow you to have a lot more control on the appearance of the contours and just get better looking contours in general. So that supplementing factor is key with site grading. So things are a little bit busy looking. I'm going to set this back to just contours. I see a few of them there. Let's go to the 1 and 5 foot, in fact. Okay. So I've got the basis of my drainage surface. What I'm going to do next is to put a boundary around this thing. And to save a little time, I've drawn the boundary already. So let me turn it on. I have it on a frozen layer. It's just a basic polyline, but let me show you what it is. Unthaw the boundary layer. What this is a polyline that goes around the extents of my parking lot. And I've just got an offset of 3/10 there. And you want to do 2 3/10 or so seems to work just about right. We want to use this as an outer boundary around our surface. Like we said, this is our drainage surface. In other words, it's also going to represent the finish grade of our pavement or our blacktop in our parking lot. So I'm going to put this as a boundary around here. But before I do, I'm just going to adjust a little bit. So when I drew these feature lines in right here, I just kind of rough these in because it's not an exact science here. So the boundary I have here, I'm just going to adjust this to tie right in to that. Okay, so it matches the extents of that. The grading outside of this will be handled in a different way. So all of our parking lot grades are going to be managed by this surface. Other elevations where we tie in up here will be done on a more manual basis. So I'm going to do the same thing to the boundary here. And just adjust this a little bit so we're at roughly that 3/10 offset. Okay, so I'm making this an outer boundary. I pick on my surface, I have add data, and I have boundaries. Another common tool, if you're totally new to Civil 3D, it's just something to limit the triangulation in your surface. Very common command in Civil 3D. So add boundaries, and I go and pick, we'll call this outer. The type of boundary is going to be a outer boundary, and we want it to be a non-destructive. What non-destructive means, if it's turned on, my surface will trim exactly to the polyline. If this is turned off, that polyline boundary will eliminate entire sets of triangles that it touches, meaning any triangle that it crosses will be eliminated from the surface. And we'd end up with a tin that's very small. Mid-ordinate distance, this is about how it triangulates along curves right here. So I've got curves in this boundary. A tin can't have any curves in it. It only approximates it with chords. So if I set this to 0.1, it'll make more sense when I put the boundary in there. If I set it to 0.1, this green line here, this is the, let me show it over here. This green line here, this is the limits or the outer boundary of my surface, even though the cyan line was the polyline I used. So what the mid-ordinate distance is this distance right here to here. So it's the distance between the midpoint of the chord of the arc and the arc itself. That is no greater than 0.1. I kind of rough that in there, but the what do we have for a length? 0.1006. So these might seem like small details, but they make a big difference in terms of how your tin triangulates in detailed site designs like this. So if I look at this surface now I'm starting to create something that represents more of a parking lot. So if I didn't have any curb and it was just a very basic blacktop surface, you know, I'm getting pretty close. I need to spend some more time designing this, but this would be a very quick way if we just had blacktop or asphalt. But we've got curb and we have curb islands. The other thing is this surface doesn't give me a whole lot of flexibility. I only have feature lines, a feature line on the outside. So I'm going to draw a couple other ones in here that give me some more control on the triangulation. So I'm going to create another feature line, put in the same site. This one I'm going to connect right here and right here. Okay. I'm also going to make a couple right here so I can control some of the triangulation around this building entrance here. So if I need to flatten it out for ADA requirements, I have some of those feature lines to do that. You notice when I did my offset of the feature line here, it put these same vertices in here. I'm going to hang on to those, but I'm going to set my grade to be constant from this corner to this corner. So this introduces another feature line tool. If I pick on this feature line, I have a command up here, set grade slope between points. I'm going to pick on that. And if I pick this point right here, it tells me what's the elevation. It's 808.8. I can hit enter. And as I drag my cursor down, you can see it highlighting those elevation points in the middle here. I go to whatever endpoint I want and I pick that, and it says specify grade. It actually calculates the grade between those 2 points. So if I just hit enter now and accept this, it will adjust those 2 points. Let me make sure my surface is on rebuild automatic, and you should now see those contours adjust a little bit. So we have a constant grade back here, and on the face of the building we have it flattening out by the entrance. So I'm going to draw a couple more feature lines in here, like I said, to control some of the grades right up by the entrance. So again, create feature line command prompts me for site. We're going to still work in the drainage site and hit OK. And again, I'm just snapping to those locations. I'm going to snap to that point as well. I'll put another one right down here. Okay. So those are feature lines. They're in the site, but they're not in the surface yet. So I need to pick these feature lines and select Add to Surfaces break line. We're going to put it in the drainage surface, and we're going to take those same supplementing factors. I want triangulation to happen along the length of these long break lines. So 25. There's that mid-ordinate again. That doesn't come into play here because I don't have arcs in my feature lines, but if I did, that would dictate how I would triangulate along them. And as soon as I do that, you can see I start to have some control. Let's take a look at this. So I see things are triangulating along that feature line. But now there's another issue. Now it's triangulating outside my border. Okay, this is a fairly straightforward thing, but something a lot of folks miss. So if I pick on my drainage surface and I look in surface properties and I go to the definition, you're going to notice that my boundary was added before my break lines. You need outer boundaries to be the last in your list. So you can use these arrows to push them to the bottom of the list and hit OK and rebuild the surface. And now you're going to see that update with it. Okay, continuing on here. The whole point of making this drainage surface is so that we can assign elevations from it to our curb. Okay, one other change I'm going to make here. See, we have some really steep grades over here. I'm going to grab this feature line. I'm going to put an elevation point right about here. So I put an elevation point there, and then I'm going to use my quick elevation edit, and I'm going to adjust this grade a little bit. I'm going to go at -1%, and you see as I do that, I get some more control on this. We'll flatten things out over here a little bit. Flatten that out a little bit. Okay, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the design, but this is how we want to put together our drainage surface. We want to look at overall drainage patterns. We need to think about, of course, where are our curb islands, where are ridges and swales and catch basins, and we want to design accordingly. But we want to have a fairly basic surface like this. And the reason is because from here, I can create my curbs fairly easily. So these yellow lines represent the gutter line. So we're going to be ignoring the gutter itself from gutter to flange, and we're just going to grade the face of the curb and the top of the curb. So I'm going to pick the command create feature lines from objects, and I'm going to pick to start with these two polylines. And we're going to put them in the pond and curb site. I'm going to assign a feature line style of curb. And I'm also going to assign elevations. And the key here is that the elevations come from the drainage surface. So now these have all sorts of elevations that came from that drainage surface. Okay, now we can use our grading tools because we have some fairly constant slopes to deal with. So we use feature lines as break lines and surfaces when we have something like the overall drainage pattern of a parking lot. There's not a lot of constant slopes. The drainage is fairly simple, but there's a lot of kind of warping of the grades to meet existing. And you can't assume, we could have, for example, taken this feature line that I drew along the face of the building and run a grading object at 2% out, but that wouldn't give us a lot of flexibility. What I had done right over here, I adjusted that. Okay, but I wouldn't be able to do that if I had a grading object that just went 2% all the way out. So I like making my drainage surfaces with feature lines like this. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start grading some of these curb islands. And just looking at the time here, as we mentioned, this is a two-part webinar here. We'll get as far as we can today. We'll get the bulk of this parking lot graded. And then it might be just a touch of cleanup that would push into next week, but we'll get through the most of it today. So I'm going to set my grading type to curb face. And I'm actually going to edit this gradient. I want to show you what this looks like. If I open it up, I have a relative elevation grading defined. The relative elevation is 0.5, and I'm taking a standard Minnesota curb face, which has a slope of 0.33 to 1. And I have everything locked down, so when you do this, it doesn't prompt you for these parameters. And so it works like this. Pick on curb face, go to create grading, go pick the feature line. So again, grading objects need to attach to feature lines. I pick this. The grading side will be to the inside, and I'm going to say yes for entire length. And right away, what I get is a curb face. Okay, I'm going to put the curb top on there as well. And then I'm going to show you in 3D what this looks like. So the curb top is just a 0% 6-inch grade. There's one comment here about a polyline turning into a feature line. It will grab elevations of the first feature line. Yeah, so if this feature line right here was added to a site that already had a feature line and it was crossing it, this feature line would assume the elevations of that first feature line. So good note to make there. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do in this curb island is to put in what's called an infill. If you have a closed area within feature lines and grading objects, you can put an infill. You can see as I do that, it might be a little tough through the screen, through the broadcast, but it highlights. So I know it's going to make an infill right there. And when that little diamond shows up, you know it's created an infill. So if I go pick this surface now, remember this surface right here is my pond and curb surface. So if I look at this in Object Viewer, what I have now, if we look at the curb, you can see that curb face, you can see the top of curb, and then the infill just connects triangles across. So what about this detail here? That doesn't look like a very nice looking curb. If you remember that tessellation spacing, that was when we originally created the grading group properties. I have tessellation spacing. That's set to 5 right now. Let's bring it down to 3 and grade this other curb island, and we'll see more detail on there. So when you're putting these models together, keep the tessellation up 5, 6, 7, something like that. You don't need a ton of detail. And then when you want to see a lot, when you want to see more finished contours, you can dial this down. So hit OK. It won't change right off the bat. There needs to be a change or an edit to the grading group, and then we'll see that reflected. So I'm going to go to curb face again, create grading, and pick this feature line now. I'm going to apply it to entire length. That gives me my curb face, and right off the bat, we see a little better detail in our curb surface. I'm going to go to curb top, put this on there. And what if you don't want it to grade flat across here? What if we wanted to mound it up a little bit? Okay, I could do a distance add a percent grade. And I could pick this and go entire length and go a distance of 5 feet at, say, 10%. When I do that, you can see this contour coming in here. I can now put an infill right in here and finish out that hole. I think I may have a little hole up here too. Okay. Let's take a look at this in Object Viewer again. And now we can see that mounted up a little bit. Okay, however much you want to do that. Do you need to do that? In many cases, most people, they don't bother, but if you need to put it there, you can. Okay, let's keep moving on here. Let's take a look at the drainage surface and the curb surface at the same time in Object Viewer. So the red is my pond and curb surface and the gray is my drainage surface. And combined, they start to make what is our overall finished grade surface for our parking lot. But I want to point out a couple things here, maybe a little tricky to see. If you remember, we drew a couple feature lines right here in that drainage surface. There was one right here and there was one right here. Okay. Right now, this curb feature line doesn't have a grade break there, but I have a grade break in my surface. So it can be a little tough to see in here. But what we need to do is to put elevation points at those crossing points or those grade break points in our drainage surface. And not to be confused, you know, the comment that was made earlier about a feature line crossing another feature line that was already there. This is a feature line here, the red one. This green one right here is also a feature line, but they're in different sites. So the elevations of this green feature line do not have any effect on the red feature line. And that's the way we want it. We want the red feature lines or the curb feature lines to only pull elevations from the drainage surface and not have the feature lines themselves dictate. So what I would want to do here is to put a couple elevation points at these grade breaks. They might be pretty slight, but we want to pick those up. So right here, then in the command line I can say S for surface and pull elevations from right there. It's prompting me, it's telling me the drainage surface 808.77. I can hit enter to accept that. And we'll put one on the other side as well. Okay, so we're picking up those key grade breakpoints. Let's continue on with at least this inner curb line here. That's going to have elevations that come from the drainage surface as well. And now this boundary, it's starting to make sense. Not only is it the limits of our drainage surface, but we wanted to go a little bit past this feature line because this right here, when I turn it into a feature line, needs to pull elevations from that drainage surface. And when we paste the two surfaces together, that'll be one of the final steps. We'll see that that little 3/10 on the drainage surface gets trimmed off of there. So let's make this a feature line as well. We're going to put it in the pond and curb site. It's going to be a curb. We're going to assign elevations. And again, it's going to come from the drainage surface. If I go take a look at this feature line, it's going to have elevations all over the place. Again, we've got to pick up these grade breaks right here, though. So the simpler you make your drainage surface, the less you'd have to do this. But it's not really too big a deal. You need to have some detail around entrances and so forth. So again, I'm just pulling elevations and putting elevation points in there, pulling elevations from drainage. What about tying in over here? If I look at this feature line in Object Viewer, what's it going to look like? Well, it looks great up here, but that's the extent of where the drainage surface is. So we make the drainage surface so it stops a couple vertices short of where we're tying into existing. So this curve and straight segment right here, that's right over here. So right up here is where we tie into existing. So I can use the quick elevation edit and pick on this. Then I have S for surface in my command line. And then I can say yes for a different surface and pull elevations from existing grade. And then it prompts me 81901. That sounds good. We'll hit enter to accept that. And I have a couple vertices in between here. I'm going to run the set grade between points. One more thing, I'm going to put an elevation point right here. Pull elevations from my drainage surface. Okay, so that point right there is attached to drainage surface, or its elevations are read from it. That's read from existing. I'm going to set a constant grade between those two with this command, set grade slope between points. So pick this point up here, enter to accept it, pick this point down here, enter to accept it, and now I have elevations assigned right here and here. It's a constant grade. I can certainly adjust that after the fact when I get into more detailed design. I'm just building my model at this point. So let's go up here. I'm going to do the same thing fairly quickly on this end. Zoom in tight there. Pull elevations from the drainage surface. This point is where I tie into existing. So I'm going to pick there and pull elevations from the existing surface. Again, set grade between points. Pick there, set the grade. Okay, same operation from here. We use our grading objects and we put a curb face on there. I'm going to go entire length with this, and I'm also going to put a curved top on here. So now this curb and pond surface is starting to include curb along the building. So in some areas, like over here, we just want to match into existing. In other areas, we need to tie into the face of the building. So I'm going to use a daylight to grading object on some areas in here. I'm going to freeze these feature lines. We don't need those. I'm going to use a daylight to 3:1. I'm going to say no for entire length. I'm going to go roughly about here, all the way around to right here. So these gradient objects, you can always pick, does it go the entire length or does it just go a certain station range? When I drop that in there, now it's tying into existing. So we have some significant cuts here. It's because we have a lot of grade right here. So we, in some cases, it may be a call for a retaining wall or any number of things. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing up here. The start point will be right at the beginning there. And the end point, I'm going to grade to right about here. Matching into existing. So what about these areas between the back of curb right here and the face of the building? Well, I have to define a feature line at the face of the building. So I'm going to start by drawing a polyline. I'm going to turn that into a feature line, and I'm going to put it in the same site. And when we put it in the same site, it's going to allow us to have it interact with these other ones. So we'll give that a basic feature line style. We'll assign elevations from existing grade. Because like I said, this is an existing building. We're mostly matching into what existing grade was there, but certainly some variation. I'm going to turn on my layers. I forgot I do want to see those feature lines one more time. This one I just created here, I want to put an elevation point right at that same grade break. And this elevation, what should this be? If this is the entrance, this is the finish grade elevation here. So this is 811 right here. We're also going to put another one that would represent the width of our entrance. And so that one will be 811 as well. Okay. And the rest of these at this point are just matching into existing. Okay, if I draw a couple other feature lines, again starting with polylines, a polyline here, and another polyline here. And we turn these into feature lines, and we pull elevations from existing. Because after all, existing is right there. That's where this daylight grading was. This building feature line, that's matching to an existing right there. So we just kind of need to connect these 2 points, and these aren't constant slopes in here. But we want to form what's called a closed area. So I'm going to pull elevations from existing grade. And what we have in here now, in this whole gap, is a closed area where we can now put an infill. So I place that infill in there, you're going to see this triangulation fill in, and those contours come in there. So let's take a quick look at it in Object Viewer. You can see that all fill in there. Is it doing quite what we want? Well, not really. So we can do things like put a couple extra elevation points in this feature line. And when we do that, it's going to start to give us more triangulation along this feature line and ultimately more control of how these contours look. Okay. So one final step here, and then I think we'll wrap it up for this webinar. The process on the back side here is going to be real similar, and I'll do it at the beginning of the next webinar, the part 2 of this, but it's going to be putting some curb in, some daylight gradings. We're going to add one other element to it, which is going to be to put a retaining wall on the back side of this. This will be much like adding a daylight to surface grading, but it'll just be a much steeper slope. So I'm going to go over to my surfaces here, and actually I want to point out one thing. If we grab our curb and pond surface, as well as our drainage surface, and we again look at these, what we have is basically what we want. That's our finished grade, right? Design's not quite done, but we can now start manipulating those feature lines. What I need to do is to paste these feature lines together. Thing to note right here, if we zoom in close, why does that look like that right there? My curb is sitting above my drainage surface. Well, this is a case where we have to put a grade break in our curb feature line to pick up the grade break that exists in the drainage surface. So what we need to do here is to combine these together, and we do that through surface pasting. So I'm going to turn off both of these surfaces, set them to no display. I'm going to make a new surface. We'll call it FG. And there's a nice tool called Surface Paste, and if you're not familiar with this, it's a great tool. It's where you can combine different component surfaces like we have done here, and you paste them together. And so what we want is to paste drainage first. When I do that, it shows up. Now here's the key. You paste drainage first and then your curb one second. In these areas where it overlaps, the last one pasted will control. So here's what that looks like. If I go in and paste in my pond and curb surface, now it trims that out, and we get a combined surface. Let's open this in Object Viewer again, and we get one surface. Okay. So the key to all this, remember the drainage surface we made, very basic set of feature lines. At any point, we can manipulate those feature lines, and we can change the overall drainage of our surface. And then from there, at any point, we can grab our curb feature lines, and we can pull elevations from that drainage surface again. That's the whole point of this model, is that each and every one of these vertices, each and every one of these, we don't have to think about the exact grade for each one of those. So when we come back to part 2, we will finish the side here, and we'll also fill in some gradings. So just one question that came in here: why don't you keep all the feature lines together right away? Why not avoid the pasting? Because what we don't want is feature line interaction between the curve lines and the drainage feature lines. What I want to be able to do is to keep that independent. If we start putting those feature lines from both of those in the same site, some of this interaction that we have right here, where I can put an infill in there. So let me open up. Let me turn on those drainage feature lines. I was able to put this infill right in here, and this fills this whole area in between the building and the back of curb. If these drainage feature lines right here, these ones I have selected, if those are in the same site, they're going to interact with all of this. They're not going to allow that infill. And even worse, these drainage feature lines, if they cross this grading object right here, this is a curb face and a curb top, a sharp grade change there. Feature lines will interact with grading object created feature lines as well. So this line right here, that's in fact like an embedded feature line. So if that's in the same site as this feature line, which is 6 inches below it, they're going to interact and assume the same elevation. We don't want that. There's another question: do you also have grading criteria for the lip of the curb and gutter? You could, exactly. Very easy to create. I don't put it in here, and I find that most of my clients are able to get away with not grading the lip or the gutter of the curb. That the grades work well enough. So think about a little on your end why that would be. But there's nothing saying that this original feature line couldn't represent the lip of curb, and that we then grade gutter, face, and top. It just gets a lot trickier when you have to start dealing with tip out and tip in curb.